name is Alfie Gaithorne-Hardy. I'm a researcher based at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm looking at how food systems interact with the social and physical environment. Today's session, just a few years ago, Chaboussou, and it wasn't until Daisy and Ulrich, two of the presenters today, introduced him to me that I first heard about his ideas. So Chaboussou was a man, he was French, he lived during the last century, and a core idea of his was the idea that some of our efforts at management in plants can impact their chemistry, which changes how palatable they are to the pests and diseases which then go and eat the plants. So one of the things to say there is that his ideas have almost been entirely ignored in the English-speaking farming world. And I think a core reason for this is that to properly engage with his ideas, we need to understand the practicalities of farming, but also we need to understand what's happening in the plant metabolism at the cellular level. So in this session, I'm really pleased to hopefully bring his ideas to a wider audience through three excellent speakers. So we're going to take his ideas. First of all, Ulrich Bluming is going to talk about the background to his ideas and how they developed. And then we've got Daisy Martinez, who's done a deep dive into the core science of those ideas. And then followed by Jean-Michel, who is a practitioner, works growing vines and making wine, and has been using Chaboussou's ideas for the last 30 odd years. So first of all, to introduce Ulrich. So Ulrich will be talking today without slides because of the technical issues we've just had. But Ulrich started his life as a molecular biochemist. And then, while not dropping this back part of his life, he moved into environmental issues, concerns, and interests. And it's really through combining these two interests that Ulrich has made such a difference to so many people and is brought together these ideas today, focusing on Chaboussou. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, Ulrich, to start this session. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I think it may be at my end that the technical problems come. We can't show the slides that I've prepared, so I'm going to try and do it without the slides. I hope you can see me, can you, everybody, and hear? At least that's working. Okay. As a biochemist and a long interest in agriculture, I was thrilled when Jose Lutzenberger, the green conscience of Brazil, great tropical forest conservator and agriculturalist, and one time agronomist with, I think, BASF. So he was really in the thick of the agrochemical industry, saw how much damage the agrochemicals were doing, and met Chaboussou in France. And Chaboussou published a book, which I can actually show you, as you haven't got slides. He published, you can probably see this, published this in 1985, and in about 87, Lutzenberger told me about it, and I was thrilled that here at last was a scientific explanation of why organic farming worked. We've all had that experience. Most of us have read Albert Howard's book, An Agricultural Testament. There's something about organic farming that makes farming better and easier. And Lutzenberger told me about that. And after many years, with the help of Edward Goldsmith, the founder of the Ecologists, and the Gaia Foundation, I have more to say about them later, we managed to get an English translation published in 2004, which is now going to be launched as an ebook. I will tell you that later too. So now we just look at some of the science. What did Chaboussou actually propose? He had the problem that he saw the problem that the agrochemicals were actually causing more disease and pests than without them. Why is that? And he looked into that and reviewed the literature as well as doing some experiments. And because he was looking at alternatives, at least that's how I think of it, looking back, because he was looking at alternatives to mainstream agriculture, his colleagues at the INRA, the l'Institut National de Recherche de Agronomie in France, south of France, he was despised throughout. And when he finally published in 1985, the book that I've just shown you was also neglected very largely. And he died of heart failure, possibly, I imagine, exacerbated by his disappointment. But Lutzenberger took up the ideas and did a lot to publicize them. There's a German edition. It's become the Bible of the organic movement in Austria, I'm told, not in France, surprisingly. And I just heard my email sending off a message, so maybe you'll get my slides. So he and I and Teddy Goldsmith sponsoring it all got together, and Helena Paul and one of my students, Mark Sydenham, translated the book into English. So let's look at what the science is. The central idea of Chaboussou was that most pest and disease organisms, and surprisingly even viruses, now I don't understand that biochemically yet, we'll come back to that perhaps, all depend on having soluble amino acids available. Amino acids as the building blocks for proteins, for everything that the cell can do, are absolutely vital for growth. And the plant, of course, makes lots of amino acids, and it makes sugars to make its starch stores and its cellulose. But before they're polymerized into proteins or starch, the monomers, the amino acids, and the soluble sugars are an excellent food for pests and parasites. What normally happens in a healthy, well-fed plant is that the amino acid concentration in the cells is maintained at a very low level because it's rapidly used up by protein synthesis. So the amino acids disappear. But if you add a lot of nitrate to your soil, a lot of fertilizer, you boost the transfer of the nitrate into the cell, into the plant cell. That's the whole idea of adding it. And it's turned into ammonium salts, and the ammonium makes the vital component of the amino acids, and the amino acids are used for protein synthesis. But the protein synthesis can't go any faster than it did before, just because there's more nitrogen there. And so amino acids accumulate. And that means that any green fly or other pest or disease around can say, whoopee, here's my lunch, and come into the plant and take whatever it wants. So in that sense, he concluded that pesticides, I haven't really come to them, we'll come to them in a minute, nitrogen excess fertilizer boosts pests. And we know that from the Green Revolution. We know that if you put a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on, you get more pests. The Green Revolution is notorious for having more pests than peasant farmers had before. And then you come to the pesticides, and they do the same thing. And they do it by inhibiting protein synthesis, even temporarily, or even causing the degradation of protein into amino acids. Either of those will boost the concentration of amino acids in the cell. So the pesticides act in exactly the same way as too much nitrogen fertilizer, and even worse, by also degrading protein, which nitrogen fertilizer, of course, does not do. So pests, in that sense, cause disease. That's why we've called the title of our presentation, When the Medicine Makes the Problem, Feeds the Problem. It is literally so that when you try to kill your pests, actually with a pesticide, then the result is that you encourage pests. You may kill the pest, that particular one. For instance, if it's green fly, and you use a pesticide to kill the green fly, they've made a nice hole in the cell wall already, and you're killing them. Then what happens is that the plant, meanwhile, because of the pesticide, has increased its amino acid concentrations, and the nearest fungus can say, good, there's both a hole to get in and there's food available. So you get a fungal infection. And so you're on a treadmill, one after the other, with a pesticide, creating diseases. In the book, which is not terribly well written and very complex in a way, it's thrilling if you know you want to hear the story, but it's complex if you're new to it. Then he doesn't actually present all that sort of story very well. And so we don't quite know where we go. But what he does conclude, it makes good biochemical sense. But the story, as I've just put it, makes very good sense. Never mind the various faults of presentation and so on. But I'm not surprised that he was despised. I'm surprised that nobody has really picked it up properly and done more research on it. So eventually, we got the English translation out, and I'll come back after the other two have spoken and just launch that. The conclusion of the book is quite dramatic, and not having slides, I think what I will do most easily is just read you the last paragraph of the conclusions. He says, having discussed all that, showing that pesticides actually cause the trouble, and that you can do a lot of things without pesticides, and actually you can do some more positive things. I meant to say that, but I didn't have my slides, so I haven't. I'll come back. He concludes, first, we need to overcome the idea of the battle. That is, we must not try to annihilate the parasite with toxins that have been shown to have harmful effects on the plant, yielding the opposite effect to the one desired. We need resistance by dissuading the parasite from attacking. That's the important issue. This implies a revolution in attitude. That's, of course, what we've heard at this conference already throughout, followed by a complete change in the nature of research. That's an important conclusion. Work on plant physiology and its relationship to the resistance of the plant the resistance of the plant would be particularly important. In other words, we need a deeper understanding of the relationship between the conditioning of the plant and the proliferation of the parasite. Often you will see when a pesticide doesn't work anymore, that often you'll see that the pest is blamed for having become resistant to the pesticide. Chabousou's interpretation is the other way up. It says what has happened when you've used a lot of pesticide is you've damaged the plant, and it's become much more sensitive to the pest, and therefore you get an upsurge of pests. So that is the background to the theory. Without my slides, I hope that's made sense and you can come up with questions. There are other sides to it, however, which I just need to mention. Lutzenberger himself as an environmentalist, had a great many different sorts of activities in Brazil and used the waste from a cellulose factory. The waste, I take it, is mostly lignin, which he anaerobically digested into goodness knows whatever happens in anaerobic digestion over half a year at warm temperatures in southern Brazil.
Excuse me, Ulrich, sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you. Just
yes.
In the interest of time, would like to ask that you wrap up this segment and we'll move on.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. I thought I was being warned by Alfie, but okay, that's fine. And he made a material which he sold as humoflor all over Brazil, which allowed flower growers in greenhouses not to use pesticides. And he thinks it worked as a stimulant of good, healthy growth through the Chaboussou method. Another material on the market like that is Maxicrop, also done by anaerobic digestion. We can come back to those questions later. So I will finish there and hand over to Daisy, who will describe how we have looked at the literature to see if modern literature at least is consistent with the Chaboussou ideas, and we found that indeed it is. Of course, it's not actually experimented on them, it's just consistent with them. That's good enough for the moment. Okay, so I'll hand over, or Alfie, you can introduce Daisy. I'll come back to round up at the end.
Thank you, Ulrich. So Ulrich excellently portrayed this important and profoundly new perspective that Chaboussou brought to how we control pests in farming systems. And one of the problems we have as scientists is that how do you actually determine thoroughly if these grand ideas are the reality? And this is the job that we gave Daisy. And so Daisy lives an enviable life. She's a part-time boat builder and a part-time scientist. And for the last year, she's been diving deep into the scientific literature to try and explore how well Chaboussou's ideas have been tested already. And one of the problems Daisy had is that all the literature she was looking at, all the work she was looking at, wasn't aimed at testing Chaboussou's ideas. So she was having to look at experiments which were trying to test certain ideas and see how well they related to Chaboussou's ideas. So with that, Daisy, I'm going to hand over to you for 15 minutes, please. The only other thing I'm going to quickly say is because we started late, we're going to, the organisers have kindly let us carry on a bit later to the end of this session, so we'll still have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Alfie, and hello everyone. So yes, as Ulrich said, Chaboussou's theory was published in the 80s, and as Alfie said, since then, in the time since its publication, a lot has changed. Farming practices are continually evolving in many wonderful ways, as we're hearing from the talks at this gathering. And so we felt it would be really valuable to reevaluate Chaboussou's original conclusions in light of the current agricultural context, new crops, new pesticides being used, and also the scientific context. So our understanding of crop physiology and the ways that crops respond to their environment has changed and evolved a lot as well. And so myself and Ulrich and Alfie and our colleague Margaret put together this literature review, which is now finished and we're in the process of submitting it. And so hopefully soon it will be through peer review and available. So I think I can change my own slide, is that right? I can't. Ah, got it. Sorry, everyone. Right, I've understood what I'm doing now. So just a bit of background to the context for this. So despite the diverse arsenal of pesticides, which are applied in conventional agricultural fields, herbivorous insects and microorganisms, so bacteria and fungi that cause diseases in plants, continue to cause damage to crops. And the resulting crop losses challenge our food security on local scales and global scales, and cause substantial economic losses for growers. And we know that these organisms, these pest and pathogen organisms, as we call them in the literature, depend upon acquisition of nutrients, soluble nutrients from crops. So that's amino acids and sugars acquired from crops, as Ulrich explained. And we also know that soluble nutrient concentrations in crop tissues depend strongly upon a number of factors, which include the age of the crop and its stage of development, and various external growing characteristics of the external growing environment. And what's often overlooked is the effect of agrochemicals on crop nutrition and biochemistry, and subsequent nutritional quality for pest and pathogen organisms. So we wanted to explore how these cornerstone agricultural inputs, synthetic nitrogen and various pesticides, influence crop metabolism and susceptibility to their pests and their pathogens. So I'm going to briefly summarise our findings in the review, and I'll start with nitrogen and afterwards I'll move on to pesticides. So again, as Ulrich introduced, but he didn't have a slide, and I've got a graphic here, so I'll just summarise it again. Nitrogen, of all the nutrients, nitrogen is required in the highest quantity by plants. It's absolutely vital for all aspects of crop growth and development, so it needs to be available in the right quantities for plants. And plants take up nitrogen from the soil, and they use that nitrogen to synthesize amino acids, so small molecular building blocks. And plants then string these amino acids together into complex chains that become proteins. And proteins are the stuff of life in the plant alongside carbohydrates. They make up all of the structures and chemicals that form the living plant. But because the uptake of nitrogen and the formation of amino acids is faster than the formation of proteins, when the crop is flooded with soluble nitrogen in the form of nitrogen fertilizers, the concentration of amino acids in the crop expands faster than the concentration of proteins than the formation of proteins can keep up. So you have a crop which is rich in amino acids after fertilization. And because these amino acids are really valuable nutrient sources for pest and pathogen organisms, that crop potentially becomes a really valuable nutrient source for those organisms. So it's almost as if we're saying, welcome to the banquet. Here's some really nutritious crops ready for you. So when we look across the literature, this enrichment of the pest and pathogen diet is clear, and it plays out in a number of ways, and we see a number of trends. For instance, when we look at insect herbivores on the left-hand side of the slide, we found, in reviewing the literature, we found a number of papers showing that, for example, adult females of certain insect pest species lay significantly more eggs on crops that have been fertilized with nitrogen at high rates. So they choose to raise, they prefer to raise their larvae or their nymphs on these high nitrogen crops. And once the eggs hatch, the larvae or the nymphs develop more rapidly and achieve greater body size. And they're more likely to survive to reproductive maturity and to produce more offspring overall. So in line with these trends, we found a large number of studies across the literature which documented significantly higher rates of insect herbivore population increase, or significantly denser populations of insects on crops which are fertilized with nitrogen at high rates compared to controls which were fertilized at lower rates. And similarly, when we look at disease-causing microorganisms, phytopathogens, we see in the literature that measures of crop disease severity, so for instance, the colony density of pathogens, or the lesion area, so that the extent of diseased tissue in the crop, or the production of spores by the microbial colonies, all are seen to increase when crops are fertilized with nitrogen at high rates. So the overall severity of disease increases. And so collectively, the findings on this slide support the idea that intensive fertilization with synthetic, freely available nitrogen can feed the problem of pest or pathogen damage by enriching the quality of our crops and the availability of nutrition for these organisms. So that's the simple story that we found, which is really consistent with Chabousou's ideas. But we also found other elements of the story that make things a little bit more complicated, because fertilization also impacts upon the defenses that crops have to protect themselves against these organisms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So just as our own immune systems protect us from disease, crops have a number of, they protect themselves from herbivorous insects and from disease in a number of ways. So they express physical defenses. For example, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, the waxy protective surface of their leaves and their cell walls, which are strengthened with lignin to stop pest and pathogen ingress. And crops also, in addition to these physical barriers, they also produce a number of defensive chemicals. So some of these chemicals are toxic and they kill the pest or the pathogen outright. Other types of chemicals make the crops less palatable and make them not worth eating, or makes it impossible for the nutrients to be absorbed in the gut of the pest or the pathogen. So they're really diverse, these chemicals. And importantly for this project, for our review, we see that we can split these chemicals into two broad groups. And so those groups are chemicals which contain nitrogen in their molecular structure. So for example, an example is the alkaloids. So caffeine is an alkaloid that we'll recognize and we've probably consumed today. And there are also chemicals which are predominantly carbon-based. So those are the flavonoids, the terpenoids, and the tannins. And we'll also recognize tannins from chocolate and tea and wine. So what's interesting is that the natural production of these chemicals by crops can be either enhanced or it can be suppressed in response to nitrogen fertilization. So when we looked at the literature, we found that conditions of high nitrogen availability, for example, after fertilization, typically decrease plant synthesis of the carbon-based defenses. So for example, the tannins, the flavonoids. But they can also boost or stimulate plants' production of the nitrogen-based defenses. So we see from this that nitrogen fertilization can have a really significant impact on crops' defenses against pests and pathogens. But whether that impact is good or bad for the crop depends upon the context, and it really depends upon the crop, because these chemicals, there are very many of them, and particular chemicals can be more or less crucial in different types of crops. And also, it gets even more complicated because the pests and the pathogen species can be more or less sensitive to these chemicals as well. So you might get an insect that's really deterred by one chemical, but isn't at all sensitive to another chemical. It doesn't make any difference. So it's just a really, really complicated subject area. And the main message is that, of me talking about this, is that fertilization with nitrogen doesn't only affect crops' nutritional quality and therefore their susceptibility to pests and pathogens, it also affects their defenses against them. So it's not possible to say more N is good or more N is bad. Sorry, more nitrogen is good or more nitrogen is bad for defense. It just depends on the crop and on the context, on the pest, the pathogen, the soil, the growing environment. So it's just something that we really deserves to be understood in greater detail, and we have a lot more to learn. So finally, consciously of time, I'm going to move on to talking about pesticides. So we focused on nitrogen so far, and pesticides are a completely different kettle of fish. And this is where things get a little bit paradoxical, because these chemicals, these pesticides, so insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, acaricides, these are applied to cropping systems in order to suppress pest or pathogen species, or deter them or kill them. And they should be minimally harmful to crops in the process. And of course we do know that they cause all sorts of harm to other aspects of the ecosystem, but I'm going to leave that aside. It's another story. But in this part of our study, we explored the somewhat counterintuitive idea that pesticides, via their impacts on crops' internal biochemistry, might actually benefit pests and pathogen species by improving the quality of their diet. So we looked at several studies which showed that the treatment of crops with various pesticides, and you can see some of the examples on the left-hand side of the screen, resulted in significant biochemical changes in the crop tissues after their exposure. And these changes that we're seeing are akin to those which commonly occur in plants in response to other stressful conditions, for example, drought stress, or excessive salt, or light stress, or contaminants in the soil. So it's a subtle stress response. So you might not see that the crop is visually injured by the pesticide, and it doesn't keel over. It's the crop's able to cope with the stressful situation, but it's undergoing a lot of changes at a subtle metabolic level. And the outcome of that stress response and those metabolic shifts in the crop is an accumulation of amino acids in crop tissues. And we found that in the literature again and again. Accumulations in a diverse array of amino acids, but particularly in nitrogen-rich amino acids. So, for example, glutamine, asparagine, arginine, and proline. And these compounds, we know, are super valuable nitrogen-rich nutrition for pest and pathogen organisms. And as Alfie mentioned, these studies that we were reviewing, they weren't necessarily designed to test the effect of these biochemical changes on crop susceptibility to pests and pathogens. And but we make a tentative hypothesis, however, that pest or pathogen species might make use of this pesticide stressed biochemical state in the crop for their own benefit. If they encounter the crop which has this stress-induced accumulation of really nitrogen-rich nutrition for them to acquire. So I think I will leave it there. And oh yes, I wanted to say about obviously these two effects, the stimulation that occurs in response to nitrogen fertilization that we looked at before, and the effect of pesticides are bound to occur together in the field, because these chemicals are applied to the same cropping systems at different times maybe, but in the same growing season. So there's also potential for the effects of these different sort of cornerstone agricultural inputs to occur together and maybe to compound one another and to add to each other's effects on crop susceptibility to pests and pathogens. So that's something that's really interesting and would be good to look at further. And here are my references, which will be too small for you to see probably, but I'm really happy to share them with anybody by email or to chat more if that would be helpful. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over time.
No, that was perfect. That was great. Thank you, Daisy. And I always find it amazing when I'm reading your work or talking to you about how much life is going on at the subcellular level that's very easy to forget about. So I thought that was an excellent example of the complications of how we actually manage agriculture and what it does in reality. But where that leads us to really well, I think, is to talk to someone or to hear from an expert who's been using these ideas in practice. So the last presenter we've got today is Jean-Michel Combes. So Jean-Michel was born and grew up in Bordeaux in France, where he trained in agriculture and especially in viticulture. And he's got over 30 years experience working in Chateau Pontet-Canet, looking at both the winemaking and the viticulture. And over this time, he's been developing ideas from Chaboussou and other ideas, and is now about how to grow vines well and how to make delicious wine. And he's now created his own consulting company to look at modern way of using biodynamics, so which he calls Harmonie Globale. So with that, I'm really pleased to ask Jean-Michel to talk to us now and to tell us about his practical experience. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I've been working for more than 3 decades in the same estate, and now I've gone for a few months now. And in fact, I was grown as a student with the conventional viticulture, and I applied it when I started to work in the estate. And after a few years, I started to have concern about the viticulture I was applying. And one day, almost by chance, or really by chance, I discovered a bad paper of a bad copy of a book that was that has been written by Chaboussou. It was the first one, printed in 1980, and it was called in French Les plantes malades et des pesticides, plants sick from pesticides. And I read it, and I discovered the trophobiosis theory from Chaboussou, and it was a brand new way of thinking for us, and it was so easy, so obvious, and so clear that nutrition could be at the base of good health. And this time it was a really brand new concept, but more than 20 or 25 years later, it's obvious for almost everybody that nutrition, and even for people, that if you are fed well, you are rather in better health. But for us, so more than 25 years ago, it was a true discovery, and we tried to there was no people that were using this. So Chaboussou remained at the level of research or experiments, but there was nothing practical. So step by step, we evolved in the way, and we tried to experiment ideas on the field, and then we saw that we could prevent the disease, the major disease in Bordeaux for vine is the downy mildew, with 14 days between two sprayings instead of 7 with non-systemic products. So we understand that we had to carry on in that way, and the idea was to get rid from pesticide, and because we understood that the pesticide were sometimes promoting new disease, and when we tried to kill a disease by spraying a pesticide, in fact we were creating a new one, and so on and so on and so on. So there was another way of thinking. That's why we tried to suppress more and more the pesticides. But at some point, we arrived at time where we had almost no more pesticides. So we were close to conclude, but the basic way of understanding the organic viticulture that was only based on the copper and to try to kill disease only. It was not a logical way, and in the understanding we learned from Chaboussou. So that's why we decided to go and try to find another way of thinking, and that's why we went and see with biodynamics. So we have been the first estate growing biodynamics among the great growth in Bordeaux, and so because we found almost the same way of thinking that placed the plant at the center of the concern and not the disease, and so we work no more with Chaboussou direct ideas now, but with biodynamics we were really in the same way of thinking, and that is that the disease is not the cause of the problem. It is considered with the organic way of thinking, or the conventional even, but the disease is only a consequence. And so we learned from Chaboussou that the disease is a consequence of something that is unbalanced in the plant, and he tried to explain it with the trophiobiosis theory. But
Jean, sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if your slides should be moving, but you need to control your slides.
Yeah, sure, no worry.
Okay.
Yes.
Just so
and so with biodynamic, the way of thinking was almost the same with compared to Chaboussou. And it's a major difference between organic, conventional, and biodynamics, and the Chaboussou philosophy is that in the organic, the plant is the cause of the problem. We try to kill the plant, and on the opposite, with the biodynamics or the philosophy of Chaboussou, the disease is only a consequence, and we have to try to understand what is unbalanced in the plant, to try to get rid from or to lower the coming of or to suppress the coming of the disease. So, nope. Maybe I will try. I don't know how to do. Where is the... It's never working. So I don't know how to do to move the slides. So anyway, if there's...
So at the bottom, kind of right of the screen, there's a little podium icon.
On
the far bottom right of your PowerPoint presentation. You see a slidey bar, and to zoom in and zoom out, and just to the left of that, there's a podium icon.
Here?
Are you on your PowerPoint? You
Yes.
looking at it?
Yes. I try to.
Is that button working for you?
No, I don't know where. It's the first time I do it, so usually it's working well. Anyway.
Along the bottom bar of the PowerPoint application, there's several buttons on the right-hand side.
Yes.
And on the far right, there's a little podium sign. There's a little, and it kind of looks like a TV on a tripod stand.
Yes, but no worry.
Okay.
I don't know how to
What
do
might be
it.
good, just so we can see your slides, is just along the slideshow, the list of slides on the left, you can just click on the slide that you want us to see.
Yes, but I click, but it does not work.
Oh, it's not responding.
No.
Okay. Well, I'll take your screen share. Oh,
Great.
there you are.
I moved, and so but it's just to give pictures and not more. And so we try to work with the biodynamic philosophy, and then we tried all the time to understand why the disease could develop regarding the balance in the plant. The main difference with Chaboussou is that, in fact, we do not need to make analysis. We just to try to understand the plant itself, and by its own expression, and then we just try to figure out what is the right balance, and then we just try to provide the good cares. So we use teas of plants, and with the biodynamic understanding, we have also preps, and we use many other plants like dandelion, and to get at the end a better quality for the wine, and a better crop in terms of quantity. And so we understood. I go back. So yes, we understood that the biodynamic vision has to be widened, because we started from Chaboussou with a very basic and chemical or theory based on the balance, and we try to understand it with to have a vision of this balance with analysis. Then we moved to biodynamics, and then we wanted to be wider. That's why we try to develop another concept that is much wider than the biodynamics. It's we call it harmonie global harmony in French. But it's just to try to understand the balance of the plant regarding many more interactions that are only the nitrogen from the plant, the weather, the soil, the grape variety, if it's vineyards, are change. So weather, terroir, soil, and grape variety change the balance of the vine, and then the action of people at the same time with fertilization and so on will also change. And so we do not focus only on the balance of coming from fertilization. We try to have a more global approach, and then the synthesis of all these actions make the level of balance for the plant itself. So I think that's it. What I have to say. We are pretty late. That's why I do not want to keep the voice.
Thank you enormously, Jean-Michel. And so as a scientist, it's incredibly powerful for me to hear and work with people like you who can bring practice to test our hypotheses and to give us new hypotheses, new ideas to test as well. And that's what I think is so powerful about this session, is bringing together the ideas, the science and the practice. So now Ulrich is going to got 2 minutes, if that's okay, Ulrich, to talk about what you've been doing with the new book, and then we'll go back on to questions.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Michel. That was exactly what's needed, and it stresses that the Chaboussou idea, after all it's old, needs to be followed up. What it's done is given us a new direction for development and research in all sorts of ways into agriculture, and indeed beyond that. I think much of the same ideas apply to human health. What I need to say, and without a slide I'll have a little bit of difficulty, is that this English translation of 2004, it's now unobtainable. Amazon sell it for several £100. I don't know whether anybody's ever tried to buy it like that, or whether it's really available. So that has now been relaunched as a digital book for free by the Gaia Foundation in London. And you can look up Gaia Foundation and their website. I had a slide showing the actual connection to the book, which I can't show you now. And that's very important to note that is the book. What it does really is give us modern scientists an agenda of what needs to be followed. We've left out of the account and of my discussion and of Daisy's as well, necessarily a lot of the things that matter. And for instance, the whole role of micronutrients, copper, manganese, iron, and so on, and the balance between them matters very much. And a lot of improvements in agriculture could be made if we understood those better. So I think that is what all I need to say now. There's an awful lot of questions outstanding of where we go next. And what I'm hoping we can do is apply for grants and actually do some physical research on the ground to expand on these ideas and see where they take us. So this can indeed be called a revolution in agronomy rather than agriculture. It's the science of agriculture that is affected, but it will have enormous practical consequences. It's a new direction to go in. And I will leave it there and open it for questions. I think we're all happy to answer whatever there is. So please go ahead, Alfie.
So thank you again, Ulrich, and thank you all three of the presenters now. And I think everyone's going to be brought back now for the questions. So if Daisy and Jean-Michel could come on as well, that's great. What I'm going to suggest is that when I ask the questions for you, then so a lot of these questions, the majority of the questions seem to focus on Daisy's work, but I think that Jean-Michel and Ulrich may well have practical or other considerations to give to these as well. So the first questions are asking the question about, does nitrogen-rich organic fertilizer have the same issues, same impacts as soluble nitrogen fertilizers? So Daisy, do you want to start off trying to saying what you can on that, and then Jean-Michel, Ulrich, do chip in as well?
Yeah.
Sorry, you go on.
Shall I go ahead, Ulrich? Yeah, thanks for that question. And that's a really, really interesting question. And I don't know any specific answers to it, because I focused, when I was looking at the literature, I was focusing on synthetic nitrogen inputs. But I think that we can kind of, well, I could again tentatively hypothesize that the way that the synthetic nitrogen is very rapidly available to plants, and it's taken up very fast, and the production of amino acids happens very fast, that if plants are offered nitrogen sources which are not as freely available, which take longer to become available to be broken down by microorganisms in the soil and transformed into forms that are available to the crop, that you'd get more of a steady flow of nitrogen into the crop over time, and that in that sense that crop metabolism might be able to keep in step with that flow, with that introduction of nitrogen, and the flow into amino acids and then into proteins, rather than this this overwhelm of nitrogen that occurs with the synthetic readily available forms. But that is just my intuition from what I know about synthetic nitrogen, and so yeah, I'd love to know more as well, and that would be part of looking at solutions. What do alternative forms of fertilization? How do they affect these biochemical outcomes in the crop and the subsequent nutritional quality for pests and pathogens?
Thank you, Daisy. Jean-Michel, did you ever notice, if you were putting the same amount of nitrogen on, but in different forms, did you notice a difference in pest or disease attack in viticulture?
Yes, in fact, in high quality viticulture, we usually only use organic nitrogen and not mineral nitrogen, because it goes too fast in the plant, and it goes against quality, and for the disease as well. So it's well known in viticulture that the amount of nitrogen has to be low, and the quality of the nitrogen has to be also the best as possible. Yes.
Ulrich, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, I think so. I couldn't really, the old technical troubles come back again. Can you hear me clearly? I couldn't hear any of you clearly, especially not the question, but I take it has to do with the way nitrogen is taken up from Daisy's answer. Is that right? And the comment I would make, and Daisy and I have made them to each other, is that the form of nitrogen in the soil is absolutely vital, and we haven't really touched on that, not in our research. And Chaboussou doesn't very much, but he implies it. Most nitrogen that plants take up is bound nitrogen in the soil. So there is a limit to the rate at which it comes in, but there's an awful lot of it. So you can have a very rich soil, no limit to plant growth, but a limit to the rate it's taken up. That makes for healthy plants. And I think that's what Jean-Michel implied there in your answer. I'm sorry I didn't hear it all. Just on that issue, though, reflect back. The whole of our modern agriculture, the whole of the agrochemical industry is founded on the notion that you can add nitrogen fertilizer. And the whole industry has been built up on that. That notion was initiated in the 1840s in the total absence of any knowledge about microbes, fungi, plant physiology, plant health. One knew nothing about any of those things. And the whole of our modern agriculture has been founded on that. And that has turned out to be only a tiny bit of the story, actually. Most of it is the properties of what the soil can give to the plant, which is complex. So I don't know whether that answers any of that, but I couldn't follow that technically. I don't know.
Thank you for that. So thank you all three. And the only point I would add is that much of the farming we're doing at the moment is using crops bred in high nitrogen situations. So when we're doing modern crop breeding, we tend to breed with an excess of nitrogen around. So it might also give a different story if we start breeding in different, using different methods for breeding. So Daisy, a specific question just for you. So are the non-protein amino acids used for defense the same as those converted into protein for growth?
Can you say that again slowly?
Do you want to say the question again, Alfie? Ulrich wanted to hear it.
No, can you say the question again slowly? Or can you repeat it, Daisy?
It was a question just for Daisy, Ulrich, about
Yes, okay.
proteins
That's fine.
and defense.
Right.
So the non-protein amino acids that are used for defense do come up in the literature, and they are part of really, really complex metabolic responses that crops have in response to being eaten by pests or being infected by disease. And the production of non-protein amino acids by crops has been shown to be affected by the rate and the quantity of nitrogen applied to crops. So that's one of those impacts of nitrogen fertilization on defense. And they are still amino acids. And I guess it brings up the point that amino acids do so many different things in crops. So we can talk about them as valuable nutrient sources for pests and pathogens, but amino acids also contribute at all levels of crop metabolism to all of these different processes going on. The amino acids are essential to all of them, and they're essential for crop defense as well. So it just brings up how complex this relationship is. They're nutrient sources and they're also defensive compounds. And so we need to, it can become very granulated looking at how individual amino acids are affected by nutrition and what the knock-on effects are for nutritional quality, defense, and other aspects of crop metabolism. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, to the extent that we can. So
Yeah.
yes, that was excellent.
Okay.
A question which has come up, which all of you might have something to ask, is the potential for intercropping our crops, our cereal crops, and potentially our vines with legumes, and whether we've got any evidence if this might give a more appropriate or steadier supply of nitrogen, which might be less detrimental to both the legume and the crop. So, Jean-Michel, I know nothing about growing vines. Do people ever grow legumes within a viticultural system?
Usually no, because in the past, yes. In the modern times, no. But you know, with the waves, everything is possible. No, but many people are using cover crops, so they plant all kind of plants depending on what they want to stress the vines, or also to provide an organic source of nitrogen. Yes, it's very well known in the viticulture, but not really vegetables to grow and pick them at the end.
Daisy or Ulrich, do you want to add anything about the potential for intercropping cereals and how that might change with legumes and how that might change the nitrogen?
Well, only the obvious one, that legumes are a constant and gentle supply of nitrogen to the cereal. And that's exactly what we want, a balance between too much and too little. And on the whole, legumes will provide that. And it's an age-old technique, and we have some explanation of why it's good. I don't think I have any other. I would like to know whether legumes grown generally in a rotational farming system actually fix sufficient nitrogen for the modern world. Many people think not, but I have a feeling they have to in the end. If we do a good agroecology, we're going to have to depend on nitrogen fixers. But I'm not sure about that.
Thank you. Daisy, do you want to add anything about legumes?
I think just only another way to look at it is that by adding intercropping with legumes and rotational systems in general, we're also reducing the impact of monoculture, of the single crop, and the way that can promote pest and pathogen infestations that are that are particularly suited for that one crop. So the legumes, yeah, providing that gentle nitrogen, that makes total sense. And at the same time, diversifying the system, I think it makes sense in both ways.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things I found so interesting from your work, Daisy, is that we can't make the simple argument that more nitrogen is always bad, and actually it's a more complicated story because it depends on which plant defense mechanisms are being used. We've got time for one last question, and I'm sorry for all the questions we haven't been able to ask. But this last question is asking if the changes in plant secondary compounds, so especially terpenes and flavonoids, might also impact the micronutrient content in a way which is relevant to when we're consuming plants, to the healthy human consumer. Do any of you want to, so Daisy, I'm going to start again with you on that one. If you think changes in plants secondary compounds might impact the food as we consume it. Do you know if there was any evidence that you came across about that?
Again, I haven't read anything on that because it was kind of outside of the field that I was looking at. But yes, those compounds that are produced by plants are all part of what makes those plants nutritious for us as well. And so changes in plant biochemical, in the plant biochemical state will then have knock-on effects for the nutrients that we take in when we eat them. So again, really good point, and I don't know anything about it, but it makes a lot of sense to understand that.
Jean-Michel, do you have any thoughts in terms of making a delicious glass of wine, whether the changes in plant secondary compounds will impact the quality of the wine in any way?
Can you repeat the question because it is cutting the. So you can.
So when we are looking at Chaboussou's work and how applying nitrogen or pesticides can change the plant secondary compounds, so the terpenes, the flavonoids, would that ever have an impact large enough so that we would notice it when making or drinking a glass of wine?
In fact, the work of Chaboussou remained theoretical for many aspects, and the problem I had only for the management of disease was that there was nothing really basic and approachable. So for quality, it's about the same. I think the main interest of Chaboussou is to make people understand that there's a door, and behind the door there's something, but no one knows what is behind the door, what was behind the door, and then that's why we had to try to find another way and to develop. But the vine is much more, or the plants are much more complex than only a balance of nutrients, and so it's the biodynamics probably is the best approach that can go deeper, especially for the vine, that because we seek for quality, to go deeper in the inner side part of the plants and to understand them, to understand their soul. And it's only with the plants, with the vines with a soul in good shape that we produce better wines.
That's an excellent note, and I don't know quite how to design an experiment to test that, but that's an excellent note to call to an end on. Unless, Ulrich, I recognise, do you want to add anything about that particular question, Ulrich?
Yeah,
or I just recognise we're getting up to time.
A tiny comment. It's worth recalling Albert Howard's report of how his cattle, fed on grazing that was itself grown on compost and not with chemicals, the cattle were resistant to foot and mouth disease. And that had been forgotten when Britain had its enormous foot and mouth outbreak, and at least the occasion should have been taken to get some data and statistics on how true that is. But there's no doubt, it's not just the flavonoids that we know about. There's no doubt that just because we have defined vitamins, which after all come from plants only, mostly, vitamins are our definition. The plant contains a wealth of other compounds, and the foot and mouth disease resistance suggests that the same ideas apply, but we don't know what they come from. Just like wine has its complexities, so of course do we. That's the only comment I can add. It's worth recalling that old experiment, trying to put it into a new guise.
But
So in that case,
okay. Yes, I just wanted to add one more thing to make the step with those ideas, is that we work on another way of thinking, that each symptom of the disease means something, and there are keys of understanding for everything from disease, for everything on Earth, and we have to learn to read those informations and to understand what is the true situation. So each symptoms of each disease means something, and the presence of absence of one pest means something on the balance, and is the way to read everything on Earth. So a color, a shape of flavor for everything on Earth means something, and the most difficult is to try to be able to read those informations. And then we can try to cope with the pest by trying to provide a good solution beforehand, before the coming of the disease. So it's another way of thinking, but everything is connected.
Thank you again. And that's, again, I think a perfect, you've given another very good end note there. So with that, the first thing I think is really important to do is to thank Josh and Olivia for trying to keep us going, because I think the four of us, our souls and the computer souls, did not interact well on this session. And Josh and Olivia, though, kept us going as well as we could. And then a massive thank you to Daisy, Ulrich and Jean-Michel for answering some questions and raising very many more. And thank you to you, audience, for keeping going so late into this session. And I'm sorry that we couldn't manage to answer more of your questions, but do feel free to contact any of us later on. And Daisy, as she said, will very soon hopefully have her paper published, and will make sure that it is published as an extended blog as well, so no information will be kept from behind a paywall. So with that, I'm going to say thank you all, and looking forward to the rest of the conference, and goodbye.